very warm welcome to you this evening, which remains a bit cold, but not so cold anymore. Thank you very much for coming. After my friend and the major artist Syed Haider Raza died in 2016, we decided to institute a Raza Lecture. During his lifetime, Raza would not allow us to do anything in his name, except that the foundation was with great difficulty named after him. So the first Raza Lecture was delivered some years ago by Dr. Homi Bhabha. For the second one, we had been able to persuade the Turkish writer and the Nobel laureate Orhan Pamuk, and he had agreed, but unfortunately COVID intervened and later it was difficult to get him. Today we are very lucky to have not only a noted philosopher and a public intellectual, but one of the finest minds, perhaps, that India has produced in the last 50 years, Professor Akeel Bilgrami. Most of you know him. He teaches in the University of Columbia, and he has been a frequent visitor to India, so luckily we meet him quite often and hear him quite often. We have two discussants who are also seated on the dais. Kalpana Kannabiran, an Indian sociologist, lawyer, human rights columnist, writer and editor based in Hyderabad. She was among the founding faculty of Nalsa University of Law, Hyderabad, and co-founder of the women's rights group, Asmita Resource Center for Women. She has written 26 books, and her work has focused on violence and gender studies, indigenous and Adivasi rights, jurisprudence, equality, and anti-discriminate law. The other discussant is Alok Rai, who has taught in the University of Allahabad, in the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi, University of Delhi, and the University of Pennsylvania. He had a seminal book on George Orwell and the Politics of Despair, which seems a very apt title even today, and on Hindi nationalism. The theme that Mr. Akeel Bilgrami has chosen is the reach of truth. And as a poet and art lover, I have always wondered if there is any truth at all, or if it is a very enduring fiction that humans have created. The Vedic Upanishadic seers said, Ekam vad, ekam sad, vipraha bahudha vadanti. Truth is one, the wise men speak severally of it. But in literature and art, there seems to be, if at all, many truths, a plurality of them. Picasso famously said, art is a lie that tells the truth. Many poets, for that matter, artists have asserted that truth is not discovered, it is invented and created. one wonders if there are no absolute truths, only tentative truths. India chose its Aptavakya, Satyamev Jayate, truth alone triumphs. But India today lies are on a long winning spree. Then we have the adage, speaking truth to power. Again, in India, the number of persons who would dare to speak truth to power is alarmingly declining. The Swedish poet Thomas Tranströmer said, truth needs no furniture. There were times when there was no truth in news, no news in truth. Remember the Soviet joke about Pravda and Investia. There was no Pravda in Vestia, and there was no Investia in Pravda. Some of us writers have lived in the belief that literature and arts are concerned with a more chaotic, plural, democratic reality rather than dictatorial, perfect, singular truth. And also that not even the smallest truth should go waste. Today we are living in a world in which truth has become a minority. Perhaps it always was, but today in India, its minority status is increasingly visible. Hannah Arendt said, as you very well know, decades ago, the result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not that lies will now be accepted as truth and truth is defamed as lies, but that the sense by which we take our bearing in the real world and the category of truth versus falsehood is among the means to this end is being destroyed. So, ladies and gentlemen, we invite Professor Akeel Bilgrami to make us see where truth reaches, or it reaches anywhere at all.
Thank you, Bajpai Saab, for that introduction and for this invitation. I'm very honored to be here. I'm very sorry that I will be speaking on these rather arcane philosophical issues at a time when there are very much more urgent concerns for all of us. Just this morning I read that the presiding fascist on the world stage has invited our own local fascist to join a board called the Peace Board to take over by a signatory's conquest the territory of Gaza. So it's very hard to speak about these abstruse issues in a time like this. We live in a time when even just mere sanity seems like a moral achievement. And I'm going to try and speak about the link between truth and morals, and think of truth as a moral achievement in this paper. And a good way to begin is by pointing out that Syed Raza did some paintings in remembrance of Gandhi. And one in particular of the 7 paintings was called Satya, and it has 6 or 7 concentric circles of different colors, under which there's the word Satya Devanagari script. And in your affectionate and admiring write-up on that painting, you point out that Raza is trying to capture how Gandhi thought that you have to peel off various layers of masking before the truth is revealed. And that's the difficulty of reaching the truth. But my subject is the reach of truth, the wide scope of truth's reach, which I believe has been masked from us by artifices of our own theoretical doctrines. And if you peel off those artifices, it becomes visible how completely natural it is to think of truth as having a wide reach, reaching all the way to the study of society and the study of art and literature. The standard denial or skepticism about truth reaching out that far has to do with long-standing familiar claims about how these regions of thought are normatively or value-laden and therefore out of the reach of inquiry that pursues truth. Now that's the standard view, and it's a view, the standard skepticism, and it's a view taken by doctrines which are opposed to each other in radical ways, but agreed on this one thing, that any inquiry that is into something which is suffused with value can't really be susceptible to having the predicate is true apply to the propositions we make about it. Well, I'm not going to traverse that familiar doctrinal ground. What I'm going to try and do instead is to come to the idea of norms and values through the notion, a notion which is very central to the study of society, so the notion of freedom. And I want to argue that the standard doctrines of the political liberal enlightenment view the notion of freedom as not having very much to do with truth, but rather having to do with choice, of exercising choice to make our decisions about how to live, what norms and values to adopt. And one of the things that you get to read, you get to see immediately if you read, say, Gandhi's book in Swaraj, is that for Gandhi, you can question this idea that freedom is a matter of exercising your capacity for choice. When you see right from the first few pages of that work that he's very keen to say, what's driving him in that work is that you're not free if you rid yourself of a colonial master. You're not free until you have acquired the truth about civil society and norms about society, politics, political economy, and so on. You're not free until then, until you get that right. So for him, the truth about society and politics and political economy is essential to being free. it's not just a matter of exercising choices. You have to exercise the capacity for choices to make the right choices before you're free. So here's just an elementary puzzle. All the standard doctrines of the political enlightenment tell you that you're free because of your capacity to exercise your choices, and if the state and other agencies leave you alone to exercise the choices, that's freedom. And what I want to pursue is a quite different thought, which is, until those choices are exercised in the right way, until whatever reason you have for exercising a choice grasps what is true, you aren't yet free. So that's the overall theme that I want to pursue. Now, there are cliches in this whole region of thought. There are cliches. You have the founder of Christianity is attributed the thought in the Gospel of St. John that the truth shall set you free. So this is a truism, a long-standing truism for over 200 years. But how is it then that there is this chasm between the theories of the liberal political enlightenment and a truism? If something is a truism, it should be a banal and familiar truth. But all the doctrines we've become used to in the political enlightenment, which is that you're free if you exercise, you're permitted to exercise your capacity for choice. So there's a gap between where the theories stop and the cliche, and if a cliche is a familiar, if it's a truism, there's a gap between what something that's supposed to be a truism and your theories. So that's what I want to explore, and I want to explore it by a look at the whole intellectual history of the political enlightenment where this thing got developed. Immanuel Kant is a natural place to begin in looking at the liberal genealogy of the notion of freedom. Like Gandhi, he thought the central concept here was Swaraj, or autonomy, or self-governance. And he had a very particular angle on it which became central to the liberal political enlightenment. Kant began the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals by saying that we need to understand how to move from empirical psychology to moral psychology. And his idea here was that human beings have natures. Empirically, the given natures are given, and they consist of a whole range of dispositions and inclinations. What theorists, philosophers later on began to call desires, wants, and when it got slightly formalized, it began to be called subjective utilities. When desires and wants got to be characterized in degrees of strength, it began to be called subjective utilities, and a whole calculus of desire or inclinations was developed. But that was since Kant. Kant's idea was, we're given all these inclinations, it's part of our nature, part of our psychology. And he says, autonomy comes from our capacity to ask a question, which is, should we be acquiescing in the inclinations we have, of any one or other inclination? Should we acquiesce in this inclination? And he said the capacity to ask that question of what's given to you by your psychological nature is the first sign of reason. Because essentially the question is, do I have reason to acquiesce in this want or desire or inclination that I have. And even if I say, yes, I do have reason to do so, even if I do acquiesce, if I ask the question and answer it, thereby acquiescing, then I authorize the inclination. And that's what is a sign of our self-governance. If we authorize our inclinations or reject them, we have asserted our autonomy. We are no longer being ruled by what is given to us in our nature, the rule of the passions and so on. We authorize them or deauthorize them, and that is the first onset of what he thought of as reason and the first manifestation of our autonomy. Now, the political enlightenment emerged when this basic autonomy-inducing question, or autonomy-reflecting question, in Kant was applied not just to our psychological natures, but to our social conditioning. So my mother would sometimes say, I no doubt my sister also would sometimes have said to me, as she tried to condition me socially, don't do that. Bilgramis don't do that. Well, that's a kind of social conditioning. And at some stage, I can't remember at what age, I must have in the onset of Kantian reason, I began to ask, what I'm to be doing what the Bilgramis are doing? And for the most part, my answer was no. And it was a sign of, so really it's the sign of onset of reason, because the question is, do I have reason to be doing what my social conditioning would have me do? And it's reason of a kind that, so far as we know, Kant said, and Kantians of political enlightenment said, so far as we know, only human beings can ask that question. Wolves are socially conditioned by their pack, but they can't ask that question of their pack. So the notion of reason that gives rise to autonomy is the idea of the capacity to ask this autonomy-inducing question about not just our inclinations, but our social conditioning. And reason of that kind is what makes us, is the heart of the political enlightenment's conception of our notion of freedom and autonomy. And if we just acquiesce in our social conditioning without the exercise of that reason, questions of that kind, we are merely heteronymous, to use Kant's word. Okay, now, this is not to be confused with a whole range of other ideas. This notion of reason is not the idea of self-interest. What Kant meant by this autonomy reflecting question is not the question, is it in my self-interest to do what the pack is doing? That's a very specific development of the Kantian notion of reason. It came much after Kant and got elevated into a notion of reason, but that's a very thick development. Kant's notion was very thin. His notion was, is it right for me to do what my pack is doing, what my social conditioning is? Not, is it in my self-interest or anything very specific or thick like that. It's a very thin notion of reason. And this notion of reason should not be confused with all the much grander notions of reason which have become the critique of a whole range of criticism criticisms of the political enlightenment, such as most famously Foucault's. There's nothing in this very thin notion of reason that I just mentioned in Kant which has some grand telos in it. There's no grand narrative that it's riding. Nor is it self-congratulatory. Human beings may possess this notion of reason, but bees may have far better capacities in all sorts of other ways, social ways. So it's not self-congratulatory, it's not a thick notion of reason, of self-interest, and it's not generating any teleological story either. So that's the heart, that's very simple, elementary heart of the idea of freedom or autonomy of the political enlightenment. And I want to make clear that Kant himself didn't stop there. A number of other political theorists since Kant have stopped there. The most, and you can get a very good, if careless, survey of it in Isaiah Berlin's essay, Two Concepts of Liberty. Isaiah Berlin himself was very anxious to stop where I've stopped in my exposition of Kant so far, but Kant himself wasn't. And Kant went on to say that, and Kant therefore made this, built a bridge to take you from truth as the exercise of your capacity to choice to the right choices. Kant went on to say that you haven't really, by authorizing the norms you live by, overcome heteronomy. You have to choose, Kant said, you have to choose according to the moral law. So Kant had his own universalist insistence that the truth is necessary for freedom, but it was a very circumscribed universalist account of what that truth would be. And his idea was that it should be a truth which is unconditional and universal in the sense that you cannot legislate as a moral law, as he called it, a moral norm, to put it in lower profile, anything that can't be adopted by everyone. So that was his view of universalizability. There has to be a rational consistency about it. And his idea was, it's a rather deep idea, that if I exercise my agency and autonomy in making choices, then consistency requires, this is part of the universalizability, that I recognize that others have this capacity, and therefore, just by rational consistency, it rules out, for instance, that I can be paternalistic towards you. If you have the capacity to choose, then I must recognize that capacity and see you as somebody who sets ends. And so I have to respect you as a person, is his technical term for it. And so there is a recognition of an other's autonomy at all times, and that means, to put it in his terms, I can't treat others as a means. I must always see them as ends and as end setters for themselves. That's part of his universalism. Now, of course, Kant's bringing together truth and freedom goes beyond the limited idea that I was saying is very much part of the political enlightenment. So Kant had all the ingredients to go beyond the political enlightenment, but he didn't go beyond it because he insisted that the truth which you authorize in your norms must take this universalist form, which is the other aspect of the political enlightenment, that takes this universal form. So Kant provided both the choice aspect of autonomy and the truth aspect of autonomy, but only in this universalist, non-contextual, unconditional conception of what the right choices could and should be. But the very fact, I think, that he allowed you to get past the limited idea of freedom as the capacity to choose gives you the possibility of going beyond the universalist strictures of the political enlightenment, and that is the direction in which post-Kantian German philosophy took Kant. So the modifications that Hegel, and with the help of Rousseau, Hegel, Rousseau, and Marx made of Kant are crucial to understanding the limits of the political enlightenment. And here I want to give a little sermon. There is a great tendency among the cheerleaders for the political enlightenment to constantly try and assimilate, say, somebody like Hegel and Marx and Rousseau into the Enlightenment. That doesn't work. That's just wrong. They are quite explicitly, in detail, anti-Enlightenment or counter-Enlightenment figures. That's precisely why somebody like Isaiah Berlin was made very anxious by them. Isaiah Berlin was a very interesting figure. He was fascinated by all of this romantic development of the notion of autonomy. He was fascinated by it to equal proportion that he was made anxious by it. And I think it's absolutely clear that he was honest in saying this is the counter-Enlightenment which was started by Hegel and Rousseau. And I think that is the right way to think about it. You can't just assimilate everything into the Enlightenment and bloat it out so that it means nothing in the end, which is what a lot of thinkers have done. Okay, so what was this term that post-Kantian German philosophy took? I think it's very important to understand that it's a modification of Kant, not an overthrow of Kant, even though it's such a radical modification that it doesn't deserve to be thought of as liberal at all. And the first modification, which is due to Hegel, is that Hegel said, oh, you have to, if in Hegel's, I think, chief pivotal term of Kant was to say, when you ask the question that Kant asks you to pose, should I be acquiescing? Should I accept the norms of my social conditioning? Hegel says, you have to ask a further question, which is, when I ask that Kantian question, what conceptual resources, what values, norms, beliefs, etc. do I have that I can appeal to in order to answer that Kantian question? And Hegel said, you have no resources except the resources given to you by your social conditioning. You can't go off to Mars. There's no Archimedean or transcendent place you go off to. You can only appeal to things that are already given to you in your social conditioning. So for Hegel, you stand in one place in your social conditioning and get a distance and ask of another place, should I be doing whatever that other place's conditioning requires you to do? So it's never, you never escape the social conditioning in that sense. That's one major modification of Kant that was first introduced by Hegel. And I'm putting it my way. The way Hegel put it was, history, we are Geist, or we are in history, and history introduces internal contradictions in in Geist, in consciousness. So his was a diachronic way of putting it. I'm just putting it in a synchronic way by asking, well, at any given point, if I ask, should I be acquiescing in this, I can only answer by appealing to things somewhere else in the social condition. So that's my synchronic version of Hegel's point. But in order to tell you of the first pivotal term, I think it's better to do it that way. I'll bring in Hegel's the more historicist position in my lecture tomorrow. Okay, so that's the first modification. And now, it might be that Kant, my own understanding of Hegel's view here is that this generates a skepticism about Kant's universalism. Now somebody might say, no, it doesn't generate a skepticism about Kant's universalism, because after all, there may be some moral norms of the sort that Kant had in mind about means and ends, and, for example, which all social conditioning provides you the resources to answer. So there's no reason to be skeptical of the universalism. And I don't think that can be right. And why it can't be right will be fully sort of explicit when I, somewhat later, either if there's time in this lecture or the next one, bring in some considerations from Wittgenstein. But let me just put it in a summary way right now. If you take the universal to be vacuous, which is like cases must be treated alike, it sounds as if every set of norms that we are socially conditioned into have something like that common sense injunction. But as soon as you start saying in what respect is something is like something else, should one you immediately will get very different answers depending on which societies you are conditioned in. So for instance, if you just take Kant's own idea that you should always treat people as ends. Well, if you're in a society in which there are utilitarian values, you're not going to agree to that. You're not going to be conditioned into a norm of that kind. There will be no place to accept a norm of that kind, no reason to accept a norm of that kind. What utilitarian says is that to pursue social aggregate utility, you should do whatever is needed to pursue social aggregate utility. And you very well might treat somebody as a means to pursue the highest social aggregate utility. In fact, it's very interesting. If you read somebody like John Rawls in A Theory of Justice, John Rawls has a principle called the difference principle, in which he says equality can be allowed inequality can be allowed. Rawls is by and large an egalitarian, but he says inequality can be allowed if the inequality allows you to pursue the upliftment of the worst off. So that's a commitment of the difference principle. Inequalities can be permitted if the inequalities help you to promote the upliftment of the very worst off in society. Okay, so let's paint a scenario. Suppose I think that Wajahat Habibullah is a man of tremendous talent, more than the rest of us. So I say, let's pay him a whole lot more than the others so that we can incentivize him to exercise his talent and produce innovations which will improve the political economy, the social institutions and so on, and thereby improve the conditions of the worst off in society. Well, That's treating Vajradharma as a means. Right? You're not treating him as an end. I mean, if you want to particularly reward him, you should do it because he deserves to be rewarded, not because it's going to promote something else. So you are treating him as a means. And so even in the pursuit of a Kantian project like a theory of justice, Rawls slips into something which is everywhere prevalent, that you can be, use people as a means if it has good ends. And so it's not at all obvious that all societies have the conceptual resources and the normative commitments to yield Kant's moral universalism. And so I think Hegel's turn is basically anti-universalist turn when he raises that question about the social site or source for where you get the resources to answer the Kantian question. There's a second very important term and modification of Kant that comes from Rousseau and gets developed by Hegel and Marx, but it's most vividly and brilliantly original, profoundly there in Rousseau. And that's the idea that it's not just individuals who can ask the individual human beings who can ask the Kantian question, should I be doing what my social conditioning is? By and large, individual human beings constitute society and ask that question. But what Rousseau's work, Social Contract, allows you to see is that whole societies, whole groups of individuals, communities, can ask that Kantian question, not just individual human beings. Of course, the form of the question won't be exactly the same as it is when individuals ask it. When individuals ask it, they say, should I be doing what the pack is doing? But when whole groups ask it, they would take the form of saying, should one, I'm using the word one to include not just human individuals, but group individuals, if you like, should one be doing what one's tradition has always done? Right? A whole group can ask, should one be following the traditions one has always followed? So no reason to have a methodological individualism of human individuals alone asking the Kantian question. Group individuals can ask that question, and that was the idea of Rousseau's general will. It was the idea of a group. So it was a singular generality, a group functioning as an individual. Right? That was the idea of the general. So if a group can deliberate and function as an individual, then it's not just you and I as human organisms who have the privilege of asking that question. Groups can ask that question, and that was the idea of a general will. And once you admit to that, you have a whole range of possibilities that, of course, Hegel makes much of, with the very notion of Geist being a consciousness of much larger form, and you find it in Kant's, everywhere in Marx, when he begins to ask about whole groups raising issues about the tendencies of formation, for instance, like capital. Okay, so that's another modification. Who gets to ask the Kantian question doesn't have to be a human organism, individual human organism. It could be a social group who asks it. And by the way, this point was made by Condorcet to show that the nature of voting is irrational, which was then given a beautiful formal theorem to show that voting is irrational by Kenneth Arrow, and that is all in the direction of showing that voting which is done by individuals to make a decision, need not be the only way. In fact, it's often irrational, as Arrow demonstrated, and the only rational way sometimes may be to do it as a group, which is the notion of consensus. This is really the whole underlying debate about voting versus consensus as a form of decision-making. Okay. Now, I've given you the spotted intellectual history to tell you the modification of the political Enlightenment's central question in the post-Enlightenment German philosophical tradition. And I want to just make a couple of points here which I think are really what is of great interest in this direction that was taken. You see, and this brings me to the heart of the idea of the link between truth and freedom. If you see that Kant himself and Hegel and Marx and Rousseau give you the link between how truth and freedom are linked, how autonomy is not just the exercise of choice but making the right choice, and you understand that you can't make the right choice except by appealing to resources that are part of your social conditioning, then there are ways to go wrong when you make your choices. So, for instance, suppose I'm raising a question about some aspect of my social conditioning, and in answering it, I appeal to resources that are from some other aspect of my social conditioning, but those aspects of my social conditioning are just a bunch of prejudices of my social conditioning. So let's say casteist prejudice. I have some casteist prejudices and I deploy them in answering the autonomy question. Well, then I get it wrong. Right? So the idea is that reason is just a capacity to ask that question. It doesn't mean you get it right. Reason can be exercised wrongly, especially if it's part of your social conditioning, and your social conditioning, the part of your social conditioning which you appeal to answer the question is just a prejudice of which you're acquiesced in. So you can have illusions of exercise of reason. That's the important thing. You can really be under the impression that you have exercised your reason, and you, in fact, it's an illusion of having exercised reason. That comes with the idea that truth and freedom are linked. So the question arises, how can you tell? Is there a criterion? Is there a rule which tells you, here you've authorized it, and here you're under the illusion of authorizing it. Here your reason has been correctly applied, here it is an illusion of an exercise of reason. Is there a criterion? And the answer is no. There is no criterion. All you can do is ask of the place you've gone to answer the question, and ask the autonomy-inducing question about that place too. There's no rule book. Outside of a very narrow range of thinking, there is no rule book. Reason is an extremely loose and broad notion. It's a very, very small part of reason which has rules to tell you how to reason. And so there's no answer to the question. When are you correctly exercising reason, and when are you under the illusion of exercising reason? All you can do is to try and get over your illusions by asking the autonomy-inducing question all over again of that part of where you appeal to. And that is what Ashok Vajpayee was saying about Gandhi's claim that getting to the truth and avoiding illusion is not an easy thing. You've got to go through layers of reason which reflect your autonomy. So there's a kind of vigilance. There's a kind of vigilance that comes with the possession of autonomy that you have to exercise. And, Sartre understood this in a way, except that Sartre was not willing to call it reason, partly because he thought all social conditioning was a kind of bad faith. But the fact is, Sartre did understand that there isn't any getting away from the exercise of autonomy, and I think it's very important, therefore, to understand that what Hegel and Marx bring in, for all their insightful enrichment of Kant, is not an abandoning of Kant. It's not an abandoning of the idea of the vigilance that reflective reason requires. Okay, but I want to, can I have another 15 minutes? Yeah. Okay, so I want to ask, I want to raise a couple of other things which are close to my heart, because I think these are, for me, the really interesting aspects of the role that reason plays in social understanding. What I want to first point to is there's a deep asymmetry between the cases when reason gets it wrong, the capacity for reason gets it wrong, and when it gets it right. It's a very deep and interesting asymmetry. The asymmetry is that when it gets it wrong, when the reason you appeal to make a authorization of a norm is, say, an expression of a prejudice, so it's an illusion of exercising reason. When you get it wrong, you need to explain it. Why did this person merely express a prejudice? Why did this person authorize something which is merely an expression of a prejudice? Why did he not see the truth? See, so the injunction is always explain error. There should be no unexplained error. You should always so we begin to be very interested in why people go wrong in the exercise of these reason in making these choices. Why did they go wrong? What are the prejudices of society they succumb to, etc. But the asymmetry is, when they get it right, no such explanation is called for. Now, I find that an extremely fascinating thing about the human and social mind, social consciousness. It's a very fascinating thing. You don't need to explain the cases of truth. The truth that just transparently gets you to social reality, and there's nothing to explain. It's only when you get it wrong that you then ask, why did the person get it wrong? Now, of course, you can take an interest in how people get it right and why they got it right and so on, but that's sort of ancillary, further interest you might have, but it's not called for in the way that error is called for. I think this is an extremely interesting, for a philosopher, it's extremely interesting. You see, because there's something to be done in our cognitive practice if there's an error. But if you got it right, there's nothing to be done. So there isn't any importance in our cognitive practice for this other thing. So it becomes a sort of ancillary interest, which of course historians have. I mean, historians make their living in this sort of thing, and you can have an anthropological interest in why things get true, when things are true, but it's not called for when you've got the truth. So think of it as the explanations of when you've got it right as a sort of bonus. It's not called for. If you have an explanation, it's a bonus. And I'm not even sure it is a bonus, because sometimes it can actually be a rather bad thing to be obsessive about explaining everything in that sociological way about choices and getting it right. I don't think you should be rushed to historical explanations all the time. Why? Why should you do that? I mean, Foucault is so interesting because he did that sort of thing for pathologies, for regimes of incarceration, for the stigmatization through normalization of mental illness and so on. He did it for pathology, but he wasn't keen on just doing it for every case of, even when there's no pathology and when you've got it right. And I think that's an extremely interesting asymmetry. And one of the things that I think is a way to think about why this asymmetry is important is that, in a way, truth and the transparency of getting to reality when your reason is exercised without illusion is that it's transparent. As I said, you get to the reality, and in a way it's the conceptual default. When I say you have to explain error, it's a conceptual default that there's the truth and transparency, and then you have to explain the cases where it doesn't exist, right? That's something is called for. And I'm very keen to say it's a conceptual default because it's got nothing to do with statistical frequency or anything like that. It's purely conceptual. You can, in fact, be pervasively erroneous, illusory, and so on. You can be, so I'm not insisting that this is more common to get it right. Not at all. It's only a conceptual default. And in fact, I think to bring in the third figure in this potted intellectual history I'm giving you, Marx, is precisely that Marx wanted to say that in certain economic formations, you get it wholesale wrong. And that's what he meant by ideology, that you get it massively wrong. I mean, you can't get it entirely wrong, but you get it pretty massively wrong. And that's what he meant by ideology. And the overcoming of ideology is to gain transparency. The ideology is the opaque, middle, intermediary, epistemological intermediary that gets you from the transparent reach to truth. And so it can be very pervasive. It can be, a feature of a whole economic society around an economic formation like capital. And that brings me to one more point, which is that what Hegel and Marx were very keen to get us beyond Kant in was to overcome what they call the subject-object divide. And the subject-object divide for them was, I'm not going to try and spell out the exact epistemological issues of Hegel's critique of Kant, which turns on the idea of a thing in itself, or Ding an sich, and which made Kant, according to Hegel, completely unable to overcome the subject-object divide, because he had this notion of Ding an sich, a thing in itself. So reality is sort of unknowable in that sense. The object is unknowable, the subject is just separated from it unredeemably. And Hegel criticized him for that. But the idea here in Hegel and Marx, and the overcoming of ideology and so on, is that you overcome the subject-object divide when you're free of ideology and you get things right and you see through to the transparent reality, the social reality. Look, it's very easy to make this point on the non-social canvas. Take ordinary perception. Take ordinary perception. I see an object in my vicinity. There's nothing to explain. The object is transparently present here when I see it. Now, I sometimes suffer from an illusion. When I suffer from an illusion, you need to posit intermediaries that make things opaque if it's not transparent. So you talk about appearances of a bottle, seeming as if there's a bottle there, and so on. Right? So you only introduce seemings, appearances, etc. if you've gone wrong, if there's non-veridical, if you're illusion. But when there's veridical perception, you just reach through to it. That's really the same idea. So the subject and object is not divided, they are integrated in the episode of consciousness, and of course on the social canvas, that is what Hegel and Marx sought. Okay, before I quit, I promise I'll quit in 5 minutes, I want to just set up things for tomorrow by giving a little bit of structure to the idea of how the social allows us to grasp transparently the norms of our society. And for that, I just want to appeal to a rather beautiful point made in Wittgenstein's discussion of rules. And I'll just put up something on the board which I'd like you to keep in mind for tomorrow's lectures. And if the board is still there, I won't have to put it up again. So Wittgenstein asks the question, and it's really a very wonderful example because it generates, I think, the right way to think of the relationship between the social and the individual, which I'll speak about tomorrow. So Wittgenstein asks, what is the nature of our grasping or perceiving rules and norms? And though his eventual interest is in the rules of language, or meaning, he starts with an example of a traffic sign, a signpost, which is a traffic sign, which we see. And he says, when, let's say all of us, when all of us see a traffic sign, we immediately see it as turning left, as telling us to turn left. Right? So you're walking and you see the sign, or driving, and he says, how come all of us here, let's say, as soon as we see this, we see it as telling us to turn left? He says, we don't stop and scratch our heads. I'm talking about us here. We don't stop and scratch our heads and say, how shall I interpret the sign? We don't do that. We just turn left. And he says, how come? How come we are not puzzled? How come we just see meaning? What is this rich phenomenology that you see meaning in the sign? You don't see a wooden board. You don't see a wooden board with some mark on it, right? Some paint on it. You don't see that. You just see turn left. You see meaning. It's a direct, rich, phenomenological perception of meaning. So how come? How is this possible? And he says it's only possible, and he introduces the notion of forms of life, because in the background, in our social backgrounds, not in the foreground, in the social backgrounds, we've been brought up in a culture of martial weaponry, of seeing illustrations of arrows being shot which move in a certain direction. And, so many of us, we've read books, seen pictures, we've read comic books, Western comic books of the middle class, and so on, family. So there's a whole rich social background of forms of life which has nothing to do with signs and rules or anything. It's just part of our culture, it's part of our practices, he says. It's just part of our social history, our social memory, and so on and so forth. And all that background here gives us the rich phenomenology of perceiving meaning, seeing it as turn left. With somebody from another culture, let's say, where arrows are, let's say the arrows are used for decorative purposes and not for martial weaponry. They're not going to go there, and they are going to say, what is the sign, So you need a certain background of social memories, culture, etc., to be able to so much as perceive correctly what the rules are. And then the question arises, how do illusions arise? How should we deal with those illusions? And there, the real hard issues of the relationship between social and individual will come up tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Friends, you have heard a brilliant lecture, only first part of it. There will be a second part tomorrow, shorter one I think, and a discussion. But today, this evening, if there are any comments, brief comments, and any questions, sharp ones, witty ones, not so boring ones, you're free to ask. The mic will come. You will have to raise your hand. Yeah. Wazahat Habibullah. Yeah.
My name is Wazahat Habibullah. Thank you, Akeel, for a very illuminating lecture on search for truth. But in your view, isn't it too much pivoted on Western thought, on this European thought, in fact, starting with Immanuel Kant, on the nature of truth? Isn't it so that each society has, through the centuries, and particularly ours, that's the Indian society, been on a quest for truth? And therefore, would it in any way modify your thinking on the reach of truth?
So, what was it that you just said? Many societies?
I said that in all societies, there would be this search for truth. There has been this phenomenon of searching for truth. And that's specifically mentioned, of course, the Indian society. And would that not have a bearing on your tracing the reach of truth from Western and European thinking?
Yes, I think that so I was focused on the deliverances of the search for truth. All societies search for the truth of individuals. Right? Inquiry searches for the truth, and inquiry can take many forms, and in fact inquiry can one of the things we'll talk about tomorrow is how the search for truth will not have any rules, so it's not uniform. I mean, even something like natural science, which is often said to have fairly well worked out protocols and rules of reason, where by reason meant evidential reason in some natural science. So So it is often thought that confirmation theory or inductive logic and so on give you, in the search for truth and inquiry, they give you rules, etc. But first of all, it's not even true of natural science that that's uniform in the search for truth. Because if you take something like medicine, there are no rules of evidence that are going to be the same for different cultures if the very idea of cure, the very idea of health is different in different societies. You're not going to be able to say there's some common underlying rule book of evidence and so on and so forth. The very ideas of what has been searched are different. So even in natural science, it's not at all obvious that there is that kind of uniformity. And I think that the vigilance I was talking about is to be there all along for any sort of truth. I don't believe that apart from deduction, there is any notion of reason which is rule-bound. No. See, the reason why deduction is so insubstantial as a notion of reason is because it is rule-bound. So even prior to Frege and modern mathematical logic, just take Aristotle's syllogism. If you just have a syllogism like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal, you can substitute immortal for mortal and you will still get a valid truth. Right? All men are immortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is immortal. That's true given the premises. Right? Socrates is immortal is true given the premises. That just shows deduction is an insubstantial notion of reason. Right? But once you get a substantial notion of reason, then I think there's a huge gap in the search for truth. There's a huge gap between the notion of reason and the notion of reasoning. All sorts of things can be reason which don't involve any reasoning. I can be given a reason to do something. I can be given a reason by looking in your eyes, seeing that something I'm about to say might hurt you, and stop. By just seeing something in your eyes, I might stop. I've given a reason to stop. What's that notion of reason? It's got rules. It's absurd. So the search for truth has no... I think the notion of reason is a much broader notion than philosophers in a standard way of doing philosophy think. And once you acknowledge that, then I think all the difficulties of vigilance and so on that I was talking about is you're just landed with it. And Sartre was one of the first to say, it's a great anxious burden, Sartre, to have that demand of vigilance all the time. And I think nothing in Hegel and Marx overturned that aspect of Kant. Right? They give it social contextuality, but they don't overturn that aspect of Kant.
Yes?
Yeah, hello.
Lady first. Yeah, go ahead.
Good evening. I'm Jyoti, and it was absolutely amazing hearing you. But I just have a couple of questions. The first one being the idea of asymmetry, of knowing whether, not needing an explanation if the reason is not correct. I have a problem here because I think that this is not considering the psychosocial psychology of both the individual and the group, because so many times we've seen that social collectivities and even leaders, when they make a decision and which is apparently not correct and which is not right, they do not explain. And again, coming back to the micro psychology of individuals, it's more to do with the person's personality also, whether you need to explain or not to explain. So I'm not very sure that this analogy is correct in a universal sense. I know I may be oversimplifying. And also Wittgenstein's idea of the sign, I think,
No, please,
relates
it's just one question at a time. My brain is
okay.
can't handle more.
Yeah, that was a really small one, but yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So that's very. You see, the reason why I think it really isn't always a good thing to do something that isn't called for is because it can get you into trouble. I'm not saying people shouldn't be interested in interesting things. You know, if you've got a sociological interest in why people get it right in a society, that's fine. You know, but don't think of it as necessarily a good. Take Bruno Latour. Right? So Bruno Latour brought this detached sociology of science. He looked at laboratories, and so he treated scientific inquiry from a sociological point of view. What is being done in labs? How are they inquiring? And, you know, he revealed various things which are very well worth revealing. You know, get you out of the self-congratulatoriness of a lot of. But at the end of his life, he said, "What have I done? I have generated a whole bunch of climate change scenarios," and he was deeply committed to addressing the climate crisis. He said, "Here I am. I've generated this monster in which all these climate change deniers are saying, okay, let's do the sociology. They think they're doing good science when they say, you know, the ozone layer is in trouble. What? They've got their own prejudices. And that's what happened in Ayodhya. Right? You say, oh, you think you've got doing history at all? Well, you know, you've got all this postmodern stuff where you say history is, you know, just a matter of, you know, how you acculturated into something. Well, so this is just a prejudice to say there was something really. So, you know, you've got to be careful. You shouldn't just keep turning to sociological explanations. Sociological explanations has a very good point when it's there to explain error. And I think you can. It's fraught with danger to extend it, as it were, proliferate it uncritically. Or not uncritically, but as a sort of professional compulsion.
One by one.
Thank you for the talk. This is the second talk that I've attended of yours, the first one being at University of Delhi when I was a master's student. I am Sandra and now I am doing my PhD at IIT in philosophy. My question is on you talking about the social aspects which allow us to then ask the autonomy question and you have to refer back to them. And when we get that incorrect or there is an illusion of reason there, we have to appeal to other social aspects of social conditioning. And, you know, in a way, I am just trying to think that if we keep going on and if we keep referring to some other aspect and then some other aspect, wouldn't that lead to an infinite regress? If not, then what should be that ultimate aspect, the nature of that aspect in various cultures that would allow us to come to some sort of proximity to reason or removal of illusion? So that is my question.
But it can't be infinite, no? Because you can't step off the face of the earth. You can't step off the face of your society. So it's not infinite. It's just that there's nowhere else to go but your social condition. There isn't. If there's no universal, then you've only got somewhere else in your social conditioning to appeal to answer questions about anything else. And I think we just stuck with that. There isn't, I don't know what you mean by infinite. What is true is that you can't fall off the face of society. You can't. And you can't step that far back. But infinity, I mean, infinity might be if you can go to space, but the Earth is finite, or the social world is finite, so it certainly won't be infinite.
Hi, I'm Mallikarjun from IIT Delhi. I just wanted to ask, the point is well taken that reason in itself cannot provide a transcendental criteria of seeing whether we have arrived at right or wrong. So I was wondering if one could sort of talk about conscience when the meaning of truth in, let's say, two forms of life collide. And like you said, there can't be infinite regress, but we would have to speak of conscience perhaps if we are talking about truth in the moral realm. And that would necessitate a metaphysical conception of human nature somehow. And if that were the case, how do you respond to the anti-metaphysical tendencies of the age in itself? Thank you.
Yeah, I think conscience is a very good word for what makes autonomy possible. I think conscience is a perfectly good word for it. It's a word that Gandhi used a lot. And in a way, autonomy depends on conscience. It's got a slightly more moral inflection in Gandhi, but I mean, this anxiety which you're expressing is always going to be there, that, does conscience have any room or criterion for telling the difference between when it's getting it right and when it's getting it wrong? And I think there isn't any rule. That's why Kant doesn't go away. The idea that you have to keep asking the question of any other social place where you are, from which you are going to answer it. You have to be vigilant about that as well. That is what it is to be burdened by freedom. That's why freedom is not an easy thing. Sartre made a religion out of that burden, but I'm not, I didn't want to do that because there are all sorts of, I think Sartre took it in directions which I think are implausible. So for Sartre thought all of psychoanalysis is bad faith. He actually said that in one place. Later on, he gave rise, therefore, to a whole way of doing psychoanalysis, which was called existential psychoanalysis. You had people like Binswanger, you had Lane, Lane and so on in London, and they made a sort of Sartrean account of psychoanalysis, which acknowledged these burdens and had very, very fascinating results. But it does seem to me that it's his excessive statements that all of psychoanalysis is bad faith. I mean, we learn a lot by understanding why, for instance, why do I get so impatient sometimes? Why do I get so angry sometimes? Well, I learn a lot about myself, and maybe I will get to control my anger if I learn why I get so angry. Sartre doesn't really have, in these excessive moments in Sartre, he really thinks to explain these things is to, in some way, surrender your agency. And those, whereas I think the third person point of view can be enhance your agency. I mean, after all, if you can control your anger by understanding why it gives rise to it, it's a good thing. What is true and what was insightful in Sartre was that one way to put it is the very thing, i.e. understanding why you get angry, this sort of self-understanding from the outside of why one is angry, say, or impatient or something. It can enhance your agency because it can help you control it. But that very thing which can enhance your agency, if you write it large and take like Latour sometimes tended to do with the laboratory, write it large and completely large in that way, then it just abdicates your agency. That was Sartre's point. You know, if you write large the detached or third-person point of view, it's a surrender of agency. But piecemeal, the very thing which when read small enhances your agency, when read large, abdicates. And that's a rather profound paradox.
Yes. No.
My name is Parsa Venkateshwar Rao. My question is the modifications suggested by Rousseau, Hegel and Marx are very interesting additions. But if we were to stay with the Kant's position and try to answer the question in the Kantian terms, how would it turn out?
Please repeat the question.
The modifications you have worked out of the Kant's position by Rousseau, Hegel and Marx are interesting in themselves. But if we were to stay with Kant himself and try to answer the Kantian question in the Kantian terms, how would it work out?
Well, if you stop at the first part of Kant, before the universalism that I tried to expound, then you get Isaiah Bullett's position, which is that autonomy consists in being left alone to exercise your choices. Right? To be able to ask that autonomy reflecting question, you should be always allowed to do that. No state, no agency, no institution, no individual should prevent you from doing that. That's a whole trajectory of what is sometimes called negative liberty. It gave rise to a whole panoply of rights, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, even privacy. Right? And if you stop there, that's the autonomy-inducing question. But Kant himself didn't stop there, and he laid the ground, I'm saying, by linking truth. Of course, this was a very universalist truth, so it was tethered to the political enlightenment's conception, the universalist side of the political enlightenment. But once you make that, once you bridge that gap between just autonomy of the elementary or minimal kind and this truth, then you can untether it from the political enlightenment, I'm saying, in the way that Hegel and Marx.
Yes.
Ram.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for the very thoughtful lecture. I have a question and a short comment, if you'd allow. The question is about I'm curious about the place of universal multiplicity in your account of the universal.
That's tomorrow. I promise you.
Okay, sure. So let me just offer a short comment on a question that has already been asked. On the assertion that there is asymmetry between when we get the reasons right and when we get them wrong, right? Because central to this assertion is the idea that there is something naturally actually right. Not merely the idea of right, but something which exists as right. And because I would rather think that when the choices you make have consequences for others in a public setting, then all those who disagree with your exercise of reason or are inconvenienced by it will want you to explain or justify your exercise of power. And that is why the court today has to explain its judgment not merely when it gets it wrong, but also when they get it right. Because at any point of time, there are never enough sort of grounds for people to believe that the court or any institution is getting it right for everyone.
it's really hard for me to convey why this is such an interesting asymmetry in my mind. You see, when you do inquiry of any kind, even in courts and the laws, there's a great built into the very idea of inquiry, built into it, is a methodological demand that there should be no unexplained error, as far as possible. There should be no unexplained error. Why? Because you want to overcome error. So you want to understand error. But if you've got it right, then it's just an ancillary historical and anthropological urge to understand it. It's not called for by the nature of inquiry. So from the first person point of inquiry, there isn't anything demanding it. You can be a historian, that's fine. Though I told you there are pitfalls of it. I've not admitted there were pitfalls of it. And I think some of it is very much there in this disdain for history and so on that you now find. So of course the pitfalls of going that way but that's my idea, that you shouldn't, in the name of sociology, understanding history, sort of ignore that there's, from the point of view of inquiry, from the first person point of view, agency, rather than detached, you only really are troubled when there's error. Otherwise you just see what is true. Take the simpler case, not the social case. If you're under an illusion, then you need an explanation. It appears to you, you look for notions of refraction, you look for notions of where the light's coming from and so on. But if it isn't, right, you just simply see the truth from the point of view of the perceiver. There's nothing to be explained.
Yes, the last one.
Ram had a question.
Hello. That's okay. Just let him speak. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I thought one of the underlying question in this could be that, like we take Rousseau's thing that man is born free, but he is everywhere in chains. So that's a perspective that human beings are born free. Only because of various conditionings they become sort of enslaved. But there could be another way of looking at it, that human beings are not born free. Because the very condition of our existence is those social conditionings that you have been speaking about. Without that, we cannot be born. So,
you're right. That was Kant's view. That you're born with inclinations, and you ought to be asking autonomy-inducing, autonomy-reflecting questions about what you're born with. And that's what makes you autonomous. So that's exactly Kant's view you're taking.
But he sought an answer in having proper reason for acting, making the right choice. There's another question which comes, like when you discuss Wittgenstein and we see a sign, like turn left. We don't reason, we just turn left. So there's a question about how any injunctions injunctions to act or command to act or instructions to act, how do we sort of acquiesce to that? And is it based on reason, or As you said in the case of Wittgenstein's discussion, that it's something we grasp the meaning of that.
No intent. See, Wittgenstein's view, which I think is absolutely correct and profoundly correct, is that there are no instructions for action. There are no instructions for action. There are only instructions for action when there's a pathology. Take a wonderful example that he gave. I mean, that's a very interesting question. Take a great example. You know, he asks, what is the difference between my waving to a friend and my moving my arm? Right? And he says, philosophers tend to think that waving to a friend is not as basic as moving my arm, and you have to be instructed to move your arm, and then you add an intention to it, which is by moving your arm, you wave to a friend, right? And he says, so there are basic actions and there are less basic actions like waving to a friend. And so you need an instruction for how to wave to a friend, you give them more basic. So that's how lots of philosophers would like to do it. It says, in intentional action, just simply waving to a friend is the basic action. Waving to a friend is a basic action. The moving your arm is irrelevant to. Think of it.
Yes,
Just a minute.
Sorry, yes.
So suppose I write the word Bilgrami on the board. And suppose somebody so when I write the word Bilgrami, I just write the word Bilgrami. Right? If somebody's never heard my name before and is told to write Bilgrami on the board, he's going to focus on B, he's going to focus on I, L, G, and so on. Right? But I don't focus on the parts of the word. I just write the word. There's nothing in my focus which has to do with the letters. It doesn't occur to me that I must be instructed to write B first or I first. I just write the word Bilgrami. Which somebody who doesn't know my name might have to go through the pieces of the so-called more basic actions. But for me, Bilgrami is the basic action of writing, of the focus of the thing. And I think that's extremely important because the idea of a basic action is it's something you do, and there's nothing else you do in virtue of which you do it. Did you get that? It's an action you do, and there's nothing else you do in virtue of which you do it. And I think most of our actions like that. Now, of course, if I've had a fight with my friend or something, if I've estranged from my friend, then maybe I can't just wave to a friend in this unself-conscious way that I always did, where it's the basic action. And then I might say, maybe I'll move my arm vigorously and he'll see it as a friendly. But that requires the pathology of estrangement for it to go that way. Otherwise, it's just waving to a friend, which is basic. I think that's a very, very important and deep-going point.
Ram Rahman, actually bringing it into the visual and poetic, maybe for tomorrow, but I was struck during your lecture, I kept thinking of the French surrealists and their whole question of reason.
Yeah, I think the surrealist questioning of reason takes much of the romantic questioning of it one step further. And I think, I think a lot of the surrealist questioning of reason is a questioning of what they thought of as bourgeois society. And I think that the whole urge of resistance was partly, if the rationality of bourgeois society requires us to be a certain way, then maybe our art should declare itself to be irrational. So I think it's very much part of a critique of bourgeois society. And many of the surrealists were, leftists, communists, and radicals of that kind. And so there was a sort of questioning of rationality. But it was a questioning of, it was not apolitical, at least for many of them.
So, well, friends, with that we come to the end of the evening. Tomorrow will be the second part of the lecture and a discussion, Alok Rai, Kalpana ji, and of course, question answers. Some of you who have not been able to ask any question may keep it for tomorrow. Remember that and ask it. At 6 o'clock again, tea and samosa. About 6:20 we start. Come in time, take your tea in, samosa quickly, eat it quickly, leave it if you are getting late to be in the hall. Thank you very much.